Or my sister mocked our dying mother, then tried to steal my inheritance. The will had other plans. My name doesn't matter much here, but you can call me Frank Delaney, 61 years old, and I need to tell you about the year my family nearly tore itself apart over money that hadn't even been buried yet with my wife. Diane and I were married for 28 years, and together we built what most people would call a modest but comfortable life. A 4-bedroom house in a quiet suburb outside Columbus that we paid off in full 6 years ago, a retirement account that Diane managed like a hawk, and a lake cabin on 3 acres in northern Michigan that her grandparents built with their own hands back in 1958, log by log, on land they bought for almost nothing after the war. That cabin was not just property to us. It was where Diane taught our kids to fish, where she and I got engaged on the dock at sunset, where her ashes would eventually be scattered into the water she loved more than any other place on earth. Diane and I met in our late 20s at a community fundraiser for the local hospital, back when I was working nights as a machinist, and she was a young nurse fresh out of her certification program, and I remember thinking the first time I saw her laugh that I would spend the rest of my life trying to hear that sound again. We didn't have much money in those early years. Our first apartment had a radiator that clanked all night, and a landlord who never fixed anything, but Diane used to say that the size of the place didn't matter, as long as the 2 people inside it were trying to build something together. By the time we bought the house in the suburbs, we had already weathered 2 miscarriages, a layoff that put us 6 weeks behind on the mortgage, and one very rough winter where Diane's mother moved in with us for 4 months while she recovered from a hip surgery. I bring all of this up because I think it matters for understanding why the will ended up the way it did. Diane and I did not build what we had by accident, and we certainly didn't build it by handing things to people who hadn't earned them. Every dollar we had was the residue of 30 years of double shifts, coupon clipping, secondhand furniture, and long arguments about budgets that always ended with both of us more committed to each other, not less. We had 2 children, and the difference between them could not have been more stark if I had written it into fiction myself. Marcus was 31, our biological son, and he worked as an HVAC technician, the kind of job where you come home smelling like sweat and copper piping and you're proud of it because you fixed something that mattered to somebody. Paige was 33, adopted at age 5 after a difficult childhood in the foster system that Diane and I never once held against her. And to this day, I don't fully understand how 2 people raised in the same house under the same roof with the same values could turn out so differently. Paige had never held a job for longer than 4 months in her entire adult life. She called work beneath her calling, whatever that calling was supposed to be, though nobody, including Paige, could ever articulate what it was. When Diane was diagnosed with stage 3 ovarian cancer 3 years before she passed, Marcus quit his overtime shifts without hesitation and drove her to every single radiation appointment, sat with her through nausea that left her shaking, held a bucket under her chin at 2 in the morning, and somehow still managed to make her laugh on days when laughing seemed impossible. He never once asked about money, about the house, about what would happen to anything after. Paige, on the other hand, showed up to maybe 6 appointments total in 3 years, and when she did show up, it was usually to complain that hospitals gave her anxiety, that the smell of antiseptic made her nauseous, that she simply couldn't handle watching her mother suffer, as if suffering were a personal inconvenience being inflicted on her specifically. 2 Thanksgivings before Diane died, Paige sat at our dinner table, wine glass in hand, and announced to the entire family, completely unprompted, that when Diane and I eventually died, she intended to inherit everything and finally live the life she deserved. Diane put her fork down and didn't say a word the rest of the meal. I never forgot the look on her face. When Diane's condition worsened to the point where the doctors told us it would be a matter of hours, not days, Paige showed up to the hospital room carrying a small leather notebook, and instead of holding her mother's hand, she asked Diane, point blank, where the key to the safe deposit box was kept. I have never in my life wanted to throw someone out of a room more than I did in that moment, and I did throw her out, and she had the audacity to tell me in the hallway that she was just being practical. The funeral was held on a Friday in early spring. Paige wore a bright red dress to her own mother's funeral, complained that the flower arrangements were either too expensive or too cheap. I honestly can't remember which criticism she settled on because she kept flip-flopping and pulled me aside during the reception to ask how long it would take to process the will. I remember standing there in my black suit, having just watched them lower my wife of 28 years into the ground, doing math in my head about how many years I had left to deal with this woman my daughter had become. About a week after the funeral, our family attorney, a sharp, no-nonsense man named Walter Whitfield, who had handled our estate planning for over a decade, called us all into his office to go over the will. Marcus came straight from a job site, still in his work coveralls with grease under his fingernails, because he didn't want to keep anyone waiting. Paige sauntered in 20 minutes late, crossed her legs, and told Whitfield he could skip the formal reading because she already knew what was in it. Whitfield, to his credit, read the whole thing anyway. Diane had left everything to me, her surviving spouse, which surprised absolutely no one except Paige, who immediately blurted out, "Well, what happens when he dies?" and then began calculating out loud, in front of the attorney, in front of her grieving father and brother, that the house was worth roughly $400,000, the lake cabin was worth around $200,000, and our combined savings and investments totaled somewhere near $100,000 more, adding up to over $700,000 that she felt entitled to as the eldest child, adopted or not. What she didn't know, because Diane and I had drafted an updated version of my own will just 2 months before she passed, working with Whitfield in private sessions Paige knew nothing about, was that the future distribution of assets had already been decided, and it was not going to unfold the way Paige had scripted it in her head. Marcus would inherit the lake cabin outright, no strings attached, because both Diane and I knew that property would be safe in his hands, and because he was the only one of our children who had ever shown it real love and stewardship. I would retain the family home and use the remaining savings and investments to fund my own retirement and elder care. Paige would be entitled to a substantial inheritance as well, an amount roughly equivalent to what Marcus received in cabin value, but only under one condition. She had to hold a full-time job at a legitimate employer for 5 consecutive years. If she failed to do so, every dollar allocated to her would pass instead to Marcus. Whitfield explained calmly and professionally that this kind of incentive clause was completely legal and frankly more common than people realized, especially in families where one child had shown a pattern of financial irresponsibility or entitlement. I watched my daughter's face transform through at least 3 distinct shades in under 10 seconds, from pale white to a furious crimson red to something closer to purple, the kind of color you see on a person right before they either scream or pass out. She stood up so violently that her chair toppled backward and knocked 3 heavy law books off a side table onto the floor with a crash that made the receptionist outside come check on us. She turned to Marcus, practically spitting, and demanded he join her in fighting this, in contesting the will, in standing united against our father's cruelty. Marcus looked her dead in the eye, calm as still water, and said something I will never forget as long as I live. I think this condition is completely fair. Mom died exhausted, and part of what exhausted her was worrying about what would happen to you after we were gone. Paige let out a sound that was somewhere between a scream and a sob, stormed out of the office, and I later found out from Whitfield's assistant that she nearly clipped another car pulling out of the parking lot, tires shrieking against the pavement. That was only the beginning. That very afternoon, my phone rang 17 times in the span of 2 hours. I let every single call go to voicemail, and when I finally worked up the nerve to listen, I heard the full emotional arc of my daughter's meltdown condensed into a single afternoon, crying and pleading in the first few messages, then outright screaming accusations that I had betrayed her and never loved her the way I loved Marcus, then desperate bargaining and promises that she would change if I just fixed the will right now, and finally, chillingly, a message where she said, in a voice gone eerily calm, "Mom would be so disappointed in you." I deleted every voicemail and put my phone on silent for the rest of the week. The next morning, at 7 a.m., there was a pounding on my front door loud enough to wake the neighbors. It was Paige's boyfriend, a man named Chase, who I had met maybe 3 times total, always dressed like he'd stepped out of a menswear catalog, driving a $60,000 German sports car that I was fairly certain he couldn't actually afford on whatever it was he claimed to do for a living, which, as far as I could tell, involved a lot of talk about consulting and very little actual consulting. Chase stood on my porch and berated me for ruining what he called our plans, specifically a house they had apparently already picked out and were counting on Paige's inheritance to purchase. I told him, as evenly as I could manage at 7 in the morning after roughly 4 hours of sleep, that if he truly loved Paige, he would encourage her to get a job instead of sitting around waiting for someone to die so they could cash in. He didn't have much of a response to that. 2 days later, Paige showed up at my door again, this time waving a job application from a local retail store like it was a trophy, practically preening with self-satisfaction. I took the paper from her hands to look it over, genuinely hoping this was a turning point, and found every single field completely blank. No name filled in, no signature, nothing. When I pointed this out, her face crumpled into rage. She wadded the paper into a ball and hurled it directly at my chest, and stormed off without another word. Around this same time, I learned from Whitfield that Paige had called his office directly, trying to find loopholes in the 5-year clause, asking whether she could sue to have the condition removed entirely, whether part-time work would count, whether starting her own company and simply paying herself a salary would satisfy the requirement, or whether volunteer work for a charity might qualify instead. Whitfield told her patiently but firmly that the will had been reviewed by 3 separate attorneys, specifically to close every conceivable loophole, and that only continuous verifiable full-time employment at a legitimate employer would count. 3 weeks after the funeral, Marcus drove up to the lake cabin to check on the property and found Paige there with Chase and 2 people he didn't recognize, a blonde woman and a man in a golf polo, all of them holding tape measures and notepads, actively discussing which walls they planned to knock down for renovations, as though the cabin already already belonged to them. Marcus, a man who spends his workdays balanced on ladders, wiring electrical panels, and doesn't scare easily, called me immediately and then called the local police chief, whom he happened to know personally from high school. Chase tried to puff his chest out and intimidate Marcus, but 10 years of physical labor had given my son a presence that made grown men reconsider their choices fairly quickly, and within minutes the entire group was scrambling to gather their papers and clear out before the police arrived. Marcus changed every lock on that cabin the same day. Not long after, our elderly neighbor, a wonderful 72-year-old woman named Mrs. Eleanor Whitmore, who has lived next door to us for over 2 decades, came over to tell me she'd seen Paige quietly trying door handles around the back of my own house one afternoon while I was out running errands. I hired a locksmith that very evening and had every lock on the property replaced: front door, back door, and garage. Around the same period, Paige took to social media, posting long, tearful accounts accusing me of elder cruelty, of abandoning my own children, of being a cold and calculating man who cared more about money than family. Several of Diane's old friends called me in a panic after seeing these posts, and I found myself explaining again and again, patiently, exhaustingly, the actual sequence of events to people who had known my wife for 30 years and should have known better than to believe any of it at face value. By the time spring rolled around, roughly 6 months after Diane's passing, I noticed I had started sleeping through the night again for the first time in what felt like forever, only to have that fragile peace shattered by a call from my bank's fraud department flagging an attempt to open a new line of credit in my name. An attempt that had thankfully been denied after the applicant failed to answer a security question correctly, but which the bank representative confirmed had used my correct social security number and date of birth. I never found definitive proof it was Paige, and I want to be fair here because I have no interest in accusing my daughter of something I can't prove, but the timing, coming just days after I told her over the phone that the will absolutely would not be changing under any circumstances, left very little room in my mind for coincidence. I spent an entire Saturday afternoon on hold with credit bureaus placing fraud alerts and freezes on every account I could think of, and Tobias Lang, my financial advisor, ended up recommending I also freeze Marcus's and even Diane's now closed accounts as a precaution, just in case whoever was behind it decided to widen the net. In an attempt to salvage what was left of our relationship, Marcus suggested we try family mediation, and we hired a well-regarded family mediator named Dr. Rosalind Hayes to help us work through things in a structured setting. Paige arrived 32 minutes late to the very first session and immediately complained that the office was too cold. When it came time for her to speak, she talked for nearly 20 straight minutes, painting herself as the victim of a cruel and unfeeling family, until at some point in her monologue she accidentally let slip the actual scope of her financial plans: an $80,000 down payment on a house, a $40,000 car purchase, and a $100,000 investment to help fund some vague business venture of Chase's. Dr. Hayes did some quick mental math out loud and gently pointed out that even the full inheritance amount Paige believed she was entitled to wouldn't come close to covering everything she'd just described. That was the moment I finally understood something that had been nagging at me for weeks. Paige had been wildly exaggerating the size of her expected inheritance to Chase, probably to keep him interested, probably to keep the relationship afloat, and it had all been built on a foundation of lies. When Dr. Hayes asked Paige what kind of work she might actually want to pursue, my daughter wrinkled her nose and said, "Work is for people who don't have better options," a sentence I don't think I'll ever fully process. Dr. Hayes, to her enormous credit, told Paige plainly that handing large sums of money to someone who has never learned how to manage it or earn it themselves tends to do far more harm than good. Paige stood up, furious, and walked straight out of the session. 2 days after that, Paige called me in hysterics, sobbing that Chase had texted her breaking things off after finally learning her real financial situation, calling her a liar to her face. But the moment I told her, once again, that I would not be amending the will, her tears evaporated instantly, and she went right back to screaming at me over the phone. In January, roughly 4 months after Diane passed, my credit card company flagged 3 suspicious charges totaling nearly $2,000, all going toward rent payments for an apartment I had never heard of. I realized Paige must have memorized my card number back when she still lived under our roof and never lost the habit of using it. I drove straight to the police station and filed a formal fraud report. Paige called me screaming, asking what kind of father calls the police on his own daughter, and I told her, as calmly as I could manage, that her mother would be devastated to see what her daughter had become: a thief, a liar, and someone unwilling to put in an honest day's work. After that call, something in me finally settled, not into anger exactly, but into a kind of clarity. I went back to Whitfield's office to reinforce the will even further. We added language specifying that the 5-year employment requirement had to be continuous, and that any gap in employment longer than 2 weeks would reset the clock back to 0. We clarified explicitly that part-time work, under any circumstances, would not satisfy the condition. We built in ironclad protections, ensuring Marcus would receive the cabin free and clear, even if I passed away before certain administrative steps were finalized. We added a provision that if I ever required long-term nursing care, the family home could be sold to cover those costs, with any remaining balance going to Paige only if she had already met her 5 years of continuous employment by that point. Alongside Whitfield, I also worked with a financial advisor named Tobias Lang to move the bulk of my remaining assets into an irrevocable trust, specifically designed to be immune to any future manipulation, court challenge, or scheme Paige might dream up. With $10,000 of my own money, I established a small scholarship fund in Diane's honor, the Diane Delaney Memorial Scholarship, offered through the local community college to support students pursuing careers in nursing and healthcare, the kind of work that had cared for my wife with such tenderness during her illness. During all of this, I also started seeing a grief counselor, a thoughtful woman named Dr. Naomi Cross, who helped me work through not just the loss of my wife, but the slow, painful grief of watching a daughter choose greed over grace. I joined a local widowers support group, started attending a small book club with Mrs. Whitmore from next door, and made a habit of visiting Diane's grave every Sunday morning with a cup of coffee and whatever thoughts I needed to get off my chest that week. Meanwhile, life kept moving forward for the 2 people in my family who actually deserved good things. Paige's first attempt at employment was a receptionist position at a dental office, which she quit after only 2 weeks, complaining that the dentist expected her to arrive by exactly 8:30 every morning and keep patient files properly organized, demands she apparently considered unreasonable. Her second attempt was a customer service job at a call center, which lasted about 6 weeks before she got into a shouting match with a co-worker who'd criticized her productivity numbers and walked off the job without notice. Marcus, meanwhile, got promoted to site supervisor at his company, a role with real responsibility and a healthy raise attached to it. He started dating a warm, funny elementary school teacher named Lisa, and the 2 of them fell for each other the way people do when they're both just genuinely good, uncomplicated humans. When Paige saw photos of them together online, she fired off a nasty text accusing Marcus of trying to replace their family, but Marcus, wisely, didn't bother responding, and later told me that Lisa had actually been the one to talk him down from firing back, reminding him gently that engaging with Paige on her terms only ever fed whatever it was she was chasing. Lisa, for what it's worth, turned out to be exactly the kind of steady, grounded presence our family needed after everything that had happened. She taught 3rd grade at a public elementary school on the west side of town, the kind of teacher who spent her own money on classroom supplies and stayed late twice a week tutoring kids who were falling behind, and she had a way of making Marcus laugh that reminded me achingly of how Diane used to make me laugh back when we were young and broke and figuring life out together. The 2 of them had been dating for a little over a year when Marcus finally worked up the nerve to ask her father for his blessing over an awkward, sweaty dinner that Marcus recounted to me in far more detail than I probably needed, and not long after, he proposed to Lisa on the dock at the lake cabin, the same spot where his mother had once gotten engaged decades earlier, and something about that symmetry felt like the universe closing a loop the right way. Somewhere between the 6th and 7th week of that second failed job, right after the call center blow-up, Paige tried one more angle that I have to admit caught me off guard with how calculated it was.
She set up an online fundraiser, one of those crowdfunding pages, claiming she was caring for a sick, elderly, and abusive father and needed community support to cover her own basic living expenses while she supposedly juggled caregiving duties. I only found out about it because Mrs. Whitmore's granddaughter stumbled across the page while scrolling social media and, horrified, sent me the link directly. The page had a photo of Paige looking somber, a paragraph about the emotional toll of caring for a difficult parent, and a donation goal of $15,000. I never once in the entire ordeal required a single hour of caregiving from her. If anything, the situation had run in the opposite direction for years. I debated reporting the page to the platform outright, but Whitfield advised me that a strongly worded cease and desist letter copied to the fundraising site's fraud department would likely resolve things faster and with less public spectacle. Within 4 days, the page had been taken down for violating the platform's terms of service regarding false claims, but not before it had collected nearly $600 from unsuspecting strangers and, worse, 2 of Diane's actual friends, who I later had to sit down with individually and explain once again the real situation. Paige never mentioned the fundraiser to me directly, and I never brought it up either. mostly because Dr. Cross had helped me understand that not every battle needed to be fought out loud, that sometimes the most powerful thing I could do was simply refuse to engage with the theatrics and let the natural consequences of her choices keep landing where they landed.
It was around this same period that Chase resurfaced briefly, texting Paige out of nowhere, asking if the inheritance situation had changed and whether she might be interested in getting back together. And to her credit, though it took her nearly a full day of deliberation according to a screenshot she accidentally sent to the wrong group chat that eventually made its way back to me through a mutual acquaintance, she ultimately blocked his number for good. Then, in August, something shifted. Paige took a job stocking shelves and working the register at a grocery store, and to everyone's genuine astonishment, she stuck with it. By November, she'd hit 6 full months of continuous employment, the longest she had ever held any job in her entire adult life. Her store manager, a patient man named Tom, mentioned to me once when I happened to run into him that Paige had actually been showing up on time consistently, picking up extra shifts without complaint, and handling difficult customers with a level head. It wasn't a dramatic transformation. It wasn't tearful apologies or grand gestures. It was just quiet, steady, unglamorous work. The exact thing she had spent her whole life insisting was beneath her. The following April, about a year and a half after we buried Diane, Marcus and Lisa got married in an outdoor ceremony at the lake cabin, surrounded by the same trees Diane's grandparents had planted 70 years earlier. Marcus made it clear that Paige could attend on one condition. She had to still be holding her job and behaving like a functioning adult. No scenes, no manipulation, no drama. She showed up in a simple blue dress, arrived early to help arrange flowers, kept her phone tucked away in her purse the entire afternoon, and for the first time in longer than I could remember, behaved like an actual decent member of our family. I stood up during the reception, raised a glass, and found myself talking about the last real conversation Diane and I ever had about love, about how it isn't really love if it only shows up when things are convenient, and I watched my daughter, of all people, wipe her eyes at that line. Later that evening, during the reception, Tom, the store manager, who Marcus had generously added to the guest list at my suggestion since he'd played such an unexpected role in Paige's turnaround, pulled me aside near the dessert table and told me quietly that he almost hadn't hired her at all, that her interview had been shaky and unfocused, but something about the way she'd asked pointed, practical questions about the actual day-to-day responsibilities of the job, rather than the pay or the schedule, had made him give her a chance. He said watching her grow into a reliable employee over those months had been one of the more satisfying parts of his own year running that store. I thanked him more sincerely than he probably realized, because in a strange way this stranger had done for my daughter what I had spent 33 years failing to do myself. Later that night, after most of the guests had gone home and the string lights around the cabin's porch had been switched off one by one, I found Paige sitting alone on the dock, in the same spot where Marcus had proposed to Lisa and where Diane and I had gotten engaged decades before that. She didn't say much when I sat down beside her, just stared out at the black water for a long while before finally saying quietly that she understood now why we'd done what we did, even if it had taken her the better part of 2 years and a job she still didn't particularly enjoy to get there. I told her I was proud of her, and I meant it, and for the first time since her mother's funeral, she didn't have a smart or bitter reply ready. About a year after Diane's death, Paige had held her grocery store job for 9 straight months, the closest thing to stability she'd ever managed. She hadn't apologized outright for everything that happened in those brutal early months, and things between us were still nowhere near what I'd call close, but she had started calling me once a week. Small conversations, nothing dramatic, just the slow, deliberate rebuilding of something that had nearly been destroyed entirely. Marcus, Lisa, and I planted a small memorial garden along the side of the house that spring, full of the same wildflowers Diane used to grow, and some mornings I'll stand out there with my coffee and just look at it for a while. I think back sometimes to that day in Whitfield's office, watching my daughter's face go through those 3 terrible colors, and I used to wonder if Diane and I had been too harsh, too calculating, too cold in the way we structured that will. But watching Paige, slowly and against every instinct in her body, learn to stand on her own 2 feet, I've come to understand that the condition we wrote into that document wasn't a punishment at all. It was the only real gift left that we could give her, the only lever strong enough to move a person who had never once in her life been asked to try. And somewhere in all of that, in the quiet, unglamorous, deeply unfinished progress of it all, I finally found something that had felt impossible in the weeks after Diane died, a little bit of hope and something close to peace. I still think about that Thanksgiving 2 years before Diane passed, the one where Paige announced across the table that she intended to inherit everything and finally live the life she felt she deserved. And I wonder sometimes what would have happened if Diane and I had reacted differently in that moment, if we'd sat her down right then and there and had the hard conversation instead of quietly filing it away as one more uncomfortable dinner to get through. I'll never know the answer to that, and I've made peace with not knowing, because dwelling on the version of events that didn't happen has never once changed the version passion that did. What I do know is that grief has a way of revealing exactly who people are underneath all the small, daily kindnesses that usually paper over the cracks. And losing Diane showed me, in the cruelest and most efficient way possible, precisely how far apart my two children had grown from each other and from the values she and I had tried so hard to instill in both of them equally. I don't say any of this with bitterness anymore, or at least not the kind of raw, burning bitterness that used to keep me up at night that first year. Somewhere between the widowers' support group meetings, the Sunday morning visits to Diane's grave, and the slow, deliberate process of watching my daughter fail, and finally, unglamorously, begin to succeed at the most basic task of adulthood, I found something like acceptance. Marcus and Lisa are expecting their first child now, due sometime next spring, and Marcus already jokes that he wants to teach the baby to fish off that same dock before they can even walk properly. Paige still calls every week, still hasn't fully closed the distance that opened up between us during those brutal early months, but she asks about the baby, she asks about the garden, and last month she surprised me by asking whether the scholarship fund we set up in her mother's name might ever consider adding a second recipient, an idea that, coming from her, meant more to me than she probably understands. I don't know if 5 years of steady work will fully undo 33 years of a different kind of upbringing, the kind where a child learns that outcomes simply arrive rather than get earned, but I've stopped needing certainty about the outcome in order to feel that the effort itself has value. Diane always used to say that people don't change because you tell them to. They change because life finally makes the alternative too expensive to keep choosing. And watching my daughter clock in at that grocery store morning after morning, long after the novelty and the spite that first drove her there had presumably worn off, I think I finally understand what my wife meant. Some nights, standing in that little memorial garden we planted along the side of the house, I talk to Diane the way I used to when she was still here, and I tell her that the condition we wrote into that will, the thing that made our daughter scream and slam doors and steal from my credit card and drag lawyers into every corner of our grief, turned out to be the last and maybe the truest act of love either of us ever managed to give her.